Hi, I'm Yitzhak Berger. I teach Hebrew at Risha. Parashat Devarim is something that we consistently read right before Tisha B'Av. The calendar is worked out that way. Of course, we have the verse Eicha Esa Levadi, which we read in the cantillation of Eicha, when Moshe said to God, "How can I bear the responsibility for leading Klal Yisrael that God imposed on him? How can he do it?" The association between Devarim and Tisha B'Av is not difficult to figure out. There's considerable admonishment in Sefer Devarim. Moshe Rabbeinu, before his death, tells Klal Yisrael, you are about to go into Eretz Yisrael, and reminds them of all of the bad things that they did, all of the things that were wrong, all of the sins, all the things that led to consequences and could again lead to consequences. The association with Tisha B'Av is appropriate. And yet, I think there's something deeper going on here as we begin Sefer Devarim at this time of year. Sefer Devarim, yes, is about, in part, Moshe's admonishment of Klal Yisrael, but it's also forward-looking. It's just the beginning of the whole Sefer. Parashat Devarim may have substantial admonishment, as some subsequent Parashiyot do, but ultimately, Sefer Devarim is Moshe establishing the covenant with Klal Yisrael once again, that if they do the right things, they'll be able to stay in Eretz Yisrael. If they observe all of the laws that are laid out, the land will enable them to remain, will not spit them out. If they're doing things wrong, right, and if they are experiencing negative consequences, by the end of Sefer Devarim, we read about the mitzvah of tshuva. V'shavtad Hashem Elokecha v'shamata b'kolo. You'll turn to God, return to God, and then He will respond to you, so that your relationship with God is rooted in your own conduct. Tisha B'Av is a day when predominantly we're thinking about negative things and their consequences. It's dominated by the avelut that we manifest most strongly in the morning when we're sitting on the floor acting like mourners. There's another dimension to Tisha B'Av, which is a dimension of introspection and looking forward. Certainly the latter part of Tisha B'Av, when we're no longer sitting on the floor, it's a time to reflect on how things could be different, how things could change. We read, for example, in Tisha B'Av afternoon, some of the things that we read from the Bible are the things that we'll read on a standard fast day, which is geared towards introspection. The goal ultimately is tshuva. It's that the negative things that were done and their negative consequences are not permanent, but they can be changed. They can, by way of tshuva, turn in a different direction. And so, on Tisha B'Av, or before Tisha B'Av, it's not merely a matter of reminding ourselves of sin and its consequences. There's also a recognition that things can be different by way of tshuva. And indeed, on Tisha B'Av, that is, in part, the attitude that we cultivate, not merely one of remembering the destruction of the Mikdash and acting like Avelim for that purpose, but concentrating on the possibility of tshuva, which the calendar will emphasize shortly thereafter with the onset of Chodesh Elul. This, I think, is the connection, not just to Parashat Devarim, which is the beginning of Moshe's admonishment, but to Sefer Devarim in its entirety, where there's a recognition that there is the prospect in the end for tshuva and for a rooted, stable, lasting relationship with God. Indeed, Tisha B'Av is the end of the year if we start counting from Rosh Hashanah. There are really two Rosh Hashanahs on the Jewish calendar. The Rosh Hashanah of Nisan, which is really about our relationship to God as His children who brought us out of Egypt when we were helpless, culminating, as far as the Torah is concerned, at the end of the Shalosh Regalim with Sukkot, where the relationship is cemented. Really, on the rabbinic level, the last one of the holidays in that cycle is Purim, right? It's the time when we accept the Torah, me'ahava, out of love, almost as a child to a father, not as a subject to a king. But then there's the other cycle, the cycle that starts with Rosh Hashanah, where we really are mitzuvim. We see ourselves as subjects of a king who has commandments for us, and they're on the Torah level. The year ends with Shavuot, which is a time of Kabbalat Torah, right? A time of recognizing that we have these responsibilities that were given to us at Har Sinai, and are challenged to do them successfully and satisfactorily. But once again, on a rabbinic level, we have another holiday, and that holiday, of course, is Tisha B'Av, which we don't celebrate as a holiday today, but one day we'll celebrate again as a holiday. It's a day that itself, through tshuva, can be transformed from a day of mourning to a day that marks the successful meeting of our responsibility as subjects of God, as King. So if Tisha B'Av marks a time when we are looking not just to the negatives of the past, but to the possibilities of the future, it's not merely the upcoming Chodesh Elul following that, which concentrates on tshuva and which will give way to the process of tshuva, but ultimately Tisha B'Av itself, through that tshuva, can be transformed from that day of mourning into a day of celebration. Shabbat Shalom.